Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time to a place that we often romanticize, the medieval monastery. We picture a quiet life of peace, contemplation, and serene contemplation. We imagine monks with their heads bowed in prayer, living a simple life of spiritual devotion. But the truth, as with most things in history, is far more brutal and much less romantic. You're about to discover a world where a life of piety was a life of immense hardship, where every moment was governed by a strict, unforgiving schedule, and where a simple prayer was often followed by hours of backbreaking labor. Imagine you're a young man in the 12th century, and you've decided to give up the worldly life and become a monk. You think you're trading the chaos of the world for the peace of the cloister? What you're actually trading is your freedom, your comfort, and your physical health for a life of quiet suffering. A little reality check for you. You probably wouldn't last a week. The life of a medieval monk sucked more than you could possibly imagine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The very first hurdle you'd face as a monk was the monastic vow. This wasn't just a simple promise, it was a life-altering commitment to three things: poverty, chastity, and obedience. This is a foundational historical fact, and it shaped every single aspect of a monk's existence. Let's break that down for a minute. Poverty meant you owned nothing. Your clothes, your bed. The book you read from, none of it was yours. Everything belonged to the monastery. You would wear the same simple woolen habit, a garment that was often uncomfortable, scratchy, and rarely washed. You would sleep on a simple bed, often a mat of straw or a thin mattress, in a cold, unheated dormitory with dozens of other men. The lack of personal possessions was a profound psychological shift, a complete stripping away of your identity. You were no longer John or Thomas. You were simply a monk, a part of the greater whole. The vow of chastity is a little more obvious, but the reality of it was more profound than you might think. This wasn't just a vow to abstain from sex. It was a vow to abstain from all worldly pleasures. This meant no private conversations, no personal friendships, and no emotional attachments outside of the communal life. The monks were to be completely dedicated to God and to their community. They were to be a family, but a family without any of the messy, emotional bonds of a normal family. This created a profound sense of isolation and loneliness, even in a community of dozens of people. A less-known detail is that the monks were often forbidden from even making eye contact with a person of the opposite sex. If a woman came to the monastery for a spiritual consultation, the monk would have to keep his head bowed and speak to her through a small grill, a physical barrier that reinforced the spiritual one. The final vow, and perhaps the most difficult to live with, was obedience. This meant that you had to obey the abbot, the head of the monastery, without question and without hesitation. The abbot's word was law, and to question it was to question God himself. This was a complete surrender of your will, your thoughts, and your personal autonomy. You couldn't just decide to read a different book or go for a walk in the woods. Every moment of your day was governed by the abbot's rule. This created a system of total control, a kind of psychological prison where you were not even allowed to have a private thought that was not in line with the monastic rule. It's a truly terrifying thought, a life where you are not even in control of your own mind. This brings us to a specific academic debate: were the monastic vows a form of spiritual discipline? Or were they a form of psychological control? Historians still debate whether the vows were a genuine attempt to create a spiritual life, or if they were a way for the institution to maintain absolute power over the individual. The truth is likely a mix of both. The vows were a powerful spiritual tool, a way to strip a person of their worldly attachments and to bring them closer to God. But they were also a powerful tool of control, a way to create a community that was completely subservient to a single authority. The result was a life of profound psychological and physical hardship, a life that was far from the quiet, serene image we have in our minds as you drift off. Let this image settle in your mind, a young man, kneeling before the abbot, making a promise to give up everything he owns, to give up all personal relationships, and to give up his free will. He believes he is making a choice for a better life, but he is actually walking into a life of immense and quiet suffering, a life that is governed by the iron hand of an ancient, unforgiving rule. The air in your quiet room is still, a world away from the profound psychological commitment of a monk's vow. We've seen how that promise was a complete surrender of self. Now, let's explore the brutal, soul-crushing reality of that vow in action, the monastic daily schedule. This isn't a suggestion, it's a non-negotiable, rigid, and unforgiving timetable that governed every single minute of a monk's day. From the moment he woke up to the moment he collapsed into bed. This is a foundational historical fact, and it perfectly illustrates how a life of prayer and piety was a life of quiet exhaustion. Imagine you're a monk in the 13th century. Your day begins not with an alarm clock, but with a bell, an iron clang that shatters the silence of the night. It's around 2 a.m. This is the first of many prayer services, known as vigils or matins. You stumble out of your cold bed, your body stiff with cold, and make your way to the unheated church. You will kneel, stand, and chant for hours, your voice joining a chorus of others in a dimly lit, frigid room. This is not a quick prayer, it's a long, drawn-out service that tests the limits of your physical endurance and mental focus. Your mind, still groggy with sleep, is supposed to be completely focused on God, but you can feel the cold seeping into your bones and the profound exhaustion pulling at your eyelids after a few more hours of prayer and maybe an hour of rest. The bell rings again for the morning service, lauds, which is followed by the rest of the day's schedule. The day is divided into a series of canonical hours, with a bell ringing to signal the start of each service. There is prime at sunrise, terce at 9 a.m., sext at noon, none at 3 p.m., vespers in the evening, and finally, compline just before bed. This is a relentless cycle of prayer, a constant mental and physical drain. The day is not yours. The day belongs to God, and to the bell that calls you to prayer. A less-known detail is that the hours in between the prayers were not for rest or quiet contemplation. They were for manual labor. This wasn't just a side activity, it was a cornerstone of monastic life. You would be in the fields, tilling the soil, planting crops, and harvesting. You would be in the scriptorium, painstakingly copying manuscripts in a freezing, poorly lit room. You would be in the kitchens, the infirmary, or the workshops, doing whatever task the abbot assigned to you. This was not a life of leisure. It was a life of hard, physical work, a stark contrast to the quiet, serene image we have in our minds. The monks were the farmers, the builders, the scribes, and the doctors of their community, all under the shadow of an unforgiving, relentless schedule. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Was this brutal schedule a form of spiritual discipline? Or was it a way to prevent sin? Historians still debate whether the constant prayer and hard labor were designed to keep the monks too busy and too tired to fall into temptation. It's likely a mix of both. The schedule was a powerful spiritual tool, a way to focus the mind on God and to create a life of profound discipline. But it was also a powerful tool of control, a way to keep the monks from having any free time for their own thoughts, feelings, or desires. It created a life that was so exhausting that all you could think about was the next moment of rest. A life that was a kind of quiet, spiritual prison. The horrifying truth is that this brutal schedule, with its lack of sleep and relentless demands, took a profound physical and psychological toll. The monks were often sick, exhausted, and emotionally drained. They lived with a constant sense of spiritual duty and physical fatigue, a combination that would be considered a form of torture in our modern world. But for the monks, it was simply life. A life of quiet suffering and unwavering devotion to a God who demanded every moment of their waking day. The stillness of your room is a peaceful respite, a world away from the relentless toll of a monk's brutal schedule. We've seen how their days were a cycle of exhaustion and prayer. Now, let's talk about a more visceral and often forgotten part of monastic life: the horrors of their food. This isn't just a story about a bland diet. It's a story about deprivation, scarcity, and the ever-present threat of famine. This is a foundational historical fact. The monastic diet was intentionally meager and monotonous, and it was a source of constant physical hardship. Imagine you're a monk in the 14th century, sitting at a long, rough-hewn table in a cold refectory. The food is brought out, and it's always the same coarse black bread, a thin vegetable stew, and maybe some watery porridge. Meat is almost never on the menu, as it's seen as a worldly luxury. The only time you might get meat is if you're gravely ill or if it's a major feast day. The meal is eaten in complete silence. While one of the monks reads a passage from the Bible, you are not allowed to talk, and you are not allowed to complain. The food is meant to sustain you, not to give you pleasure. The horrifying detail is that the food was often of poor quality, and it was often a source of stomach ailments and malnutrition. A less-known detail is that the monks were often given a small daily ration of ale or wine, which was often safer to drink than the water. This brings us to a specific academic debate: was the monastic diet a form of spiritual discipline, or was it a source of constant physical suffering? Historians still debate whether the diet was a deliberate form of asceticism, a way to mortify the flesh and bring the monk closer to God, or if it was simply a reflection of the poor state of food production and preservation at the time. The truth is likely a mix of both. The diet was a powerful spiritual tool, a constant reminder of the monk's vow of poverty, but it was also a source of constant physical suffering, a chronic state of hunger and malnutrition that took a profound toll on their bodies. The greatest horror, however, was the constant threat of famine. The monastery, like the rest of the medieval world, was completely dependent on the success of its harvest. A bad harvest, a blight, or a long cold winter could mean a winter of starvation. The monks, who were often the only ones in the community with any stored food, would have to share what they had with the local population, leaving them with even less. You would spend your days in the fields, working to produce a harvest that might not even be enough to sustain you, all while your body was already weak and malnourished. The physical and psychological stress of this would have been immense. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the monastic diet, with its lack of meat and reliance on a few basic staples, created a kind of chronic, quiet suffering. The monks were often weak, their bodies were prone to illness, and their minds were constantly plagued by the gnawing feeling of hunger. The serene image of a monk in quiet contemplation is shattered when you imagine him with a rumbling stomach and a body that is constantly on the verge of collapse. The quiet of your room is a peaceful respite, a world away from the gnawing hunger and bland food of the monastic refectory. We've seen how deprivation was a cornerstone of a monk's spiritual life. Now, let's talk about a more visceral, and often forgotten part of that life: the lack of hygiene and the ever-present threat of disease. This isn't a story about a lack of soap. It's a story about a fundamental lack of understanding of the human body and a monastery's role as a breeding ground for sickness. This is a foundational historical fact: a monastery, for all its spiritual piety, was often an incredibly unsanitary place. Imagine you're a monk in a large monastery in the 15th century. You're living in close quarters with dozens of other men in an unheated dormitory. There is no concept of a shower or a personal bathroom. The toilet is often a communal privy, a simple hole in the ground that empties into a nearby ditch or river. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale clothes, and human waste. The monks would wear the same woolen habit for weeks, or even months, at a time, a garment that was a perfect breeding ground for lice and fleas. The lack of personal hygiene was not a side effect of their poverty, it was a deliberate choice, a form of self-mortification. A less-known detail is that bathing was often seen as a worldly luxury and was often forbidden, with some monastic rules only allowing a bath once a year. This brings us to a specific academic debate: was the lack of hygiene a form of spiritual discipline? Or was it a source of constant physical suffering? Historians still debate whether the lack of bathing was a deliberate form of asceticism, a way to mortify the flesh and bring the monk closer to God, or if it was simply a reflection of the poor state of sanitation and the general ignorance of germs at the time. The truth is likely a mix of both. The monks believed that by depriving themselves of worldly comforts, such as a bath, they were making a spiritual sacrifice. But this spiritual sacrifice had a profound physical cost. The horrifying truth is that the lack of hygiene, combined with the close living quarters, made the monastery a breeding ground for disease. A simple cold or a flu could spread through the community in a matter of days, and a more serious illness, such as dysentery or the plague, could wipe out a significant portion of the monastery. There was no concept of quarantine or modern medicine. The monks, with their weakened bodies from their poor diet, were incredibly susceptible to illness, and a trip to the infirmary, which was often just a room with a few beds, was a high-stakes gamble. The cure was often bloodletting or a variety of herbal remedies, which were often ineffective or, in some cases, actively harmful. A less-known detail is that the infirmary was often the only place where a monk was allowed to eat meat. A final, grim acknowledgement that their spiritual discipline was killing them. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the monastery, for all its spiritual piety, was not a place of healing. It was a place where a small, localized sickness could quickly become a deadly epidemic. A place where a monk's physical suffering was seen not as a problem to be solved, but as a spiritual test to be endured. The serene image of a monk in quiet contemplation is shattered when you imagine him covered in lice, his body racked with a fever, and his only hope being a man who believes that the best cure for an illness is to drain a person of their blood. The silence of your room is a peaceful respite, a world away from the unsanitary and sickness-ridden life of a medieval monastery. We've explored how a monk's body was a canvas for his spiritual discipline, often at a terrible cost. Now, let's talk about a more psychological and often forgotten part of that life: the monastic rule and its unforgiving punishments. This isn't just a story about a set of guidelines, it's a story about a strict, unbending law that governed every single aspect of a monk's life, and the brutal consequences of breaking it. This is a foundational historical fact. The life of a monk was a life lived under a constant, and often terrifying, threat of punishment. Imagine you're a monk in the 11th century. You're living under the rule of Saint Benedict, a document that was not just a suggestion, but a kind of constitution for your life. The rule governs everything: when you wake up, when you pray, what you eat, when you talk, and when you sleep. It's a complete framework for living a spiritual life, and it is a powerful and often terrifying document. The horrifying truth is that to break the rule was not just to break a guideline, it was to commit a spiritual transgression, a kind of betrayal of your vows and your community. This brings us to a specific academic debate: were the monastic punishments a form of spiritual correction, or were they a form of brutal social control? Historians still debate whether the punishments were a genuine attempt to guide the monk back to a spiritual path, or if they were a way for the abbot to maintain absolute power and to prevent dissent. The truth is likely a mix of both. The punishments were a way to maintain order and to enforce a strict, uniform way of life, but they were also a way to create a community that was completely subservient to a single authority, and to ensure that no one monk was more important than the rule itself. The punishments themselves were often brutal and deeply humiliating. A less known detail is the public confession. If you broke the rule, you would be forced to publicly confess your sin in front of the entire community. You would kneel before the abbot, and in a loud, clear voice. You would have to confess your transgression. This was a powerful form of public shaming, a way to make sure that the entire community knew of your sin, and a way to break your pride and your ego. The physical punishments were even more terrifying. A monk who broke the rule might be subjected to scourging, a form of self-flagellation where you would be whipped with a leather strap. A monk who was caught talking during a period of silence might be forced to stand for hours, holding a heavy book above his head, a constant reminder of his transgression. A more serious offense, such as a physical fight or a theft, could result in excommunication, a complete expulsion from the community. You would be cast out into the world with no possessions, no home, and no place to go. This was a kind of social and spiritual death sentence, a punishment that was often more terrifying than a physical one. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the abbot, the man who enforced these rules, was often an absolute ruler, a kind of king in his own small domain. His word was law, and he had the power to forgive or to punish as he saw fit. He was the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and the monk, with his vow of obedience, had no recourse and no appeal. The life of a monk was a life lived under a constant, and often terrifying, threat of punishment, a life that was far from the quiet, serene image we have in our minds. The silence of your room is a peaceful respite, a world away from the humiliation and fear of monastic punishment. We've seen how a monk's life was governed by an ironclad rule and the brutal consequences of breaking it. Now, let's talk about a more physical and often forgotten part of that life, the backbreaking manual labor that was the cornerstone of their daily existence. This isn't a story about a little bit of gardening. It's a story about a life of constant, physically demanding work that took a profound toll on a monk's body. This is a foundational historical fact. The life of a monk was a life of quiet suffering, but it was also a life of immense and exhausting physical toil. Imagine you're a monk in a large monastery in the 13th century. Your day, as we've seen, is a relentless cycle of prayer. But in between those prayers, you are expected to work. The monastery was a self-sufficient community, and the monks were the ones who made it so. You would be in the fields, with a heavy hoe or a primitive plow, tilling the hard, unyielding soil. You would be planting crops, weeding and harvesting. The work was long and hard, and your body, already weakened by a poor diet, would be pushed to its absolute limits. A less-known detail is that the work was often done in complete silence, a form of spiritual discipline that also served to keep the monks focused on their task. This brings us to a specific academic debate: was the manual labor a form of spiritual discipline? Or was it a form of physical punishment? Historians still debate whether the labor was a genuine attempt to create a spiritual life, where a monk's work was a form of prayer, or if it was a way to keep the monks too tired to fall into temptation. The truth is likely a mix of both. The labor was a powerful spiritual tool, a way to humble the monk and to remind him of his place in the world. But it was also a powerful tool of control, a way to keep the monks so physically exhausted that they had no time or energy for their own thoughts, feelings, or desires. It created a life that was so physically demanding that all you could think about was the next moment of rest. A life that was a kind of quiet, physical prison. The horrors of this labor were not limited to the fields. The monks were also the builders and the craftsmen of their community. You would be in the workshop, with a hammer and a chisel, building the monastery itself. You would be in the kitchens, with a heavy pot over a fire. Cooking for the entire community. You would be in the scriptorium, painstakingly copying manuscripts in a freezing, poorly lit room. This was not a life of leisure, it was a life of hard, physical work that took a profound toll on their bodies. The monks were often riddled with arthritis. Their hands were gnarled and their backs were bent from years of hard labor. The serene image of a monk in quiet contemplation is shattered when you imagine him with a heavy hammer in his hand, his body aching with a profound and constant pain. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the work was often seen as a form of spiritual penance. The monk's body, with all its aches and pains, was a constant reminder of his spiritual duty. The physical suffering was not a problem to be solved, it was a spiritual test to be endured. This created a kind of perverse spiritual calculus, where a monk's physical suffering was a direct measure of his spiritual piety. A more painful day in the fields was a more spiritual day in the eyes of God. It's a terrifying and deeply unsettling thought that a life of quiet devotion was also a life of immense and constant physical suffering. The stillness of your room is a peaceful respite, a world away from the aching muscles and gnarled hands of a medieval monk. We've explored the physical toil that was a cornerstone of their existence. Now, let's talk about a more psychological, and often forgotten, part of that life: the profound solitude and psychological toll. This isn't a story about a quiet moment of reflection. It's a story about the immense mental health struggles that came with a life of quiet contemplation and isolation. This is a foundational historical fact. The life of a monk was a life lived under a constant, and often terrifying, pressure on their mind. Imagine you're a monk in a monastery in the 12th century. You've taken a vow of silence, and you're expected to go about your day without speaking to your fellow monks. The only time you're allowed to talk is during prayer services and in a specific room called the parlor. The rest of the day, you're in a world of profound silence. A world where your only companion is your own mind. You can't tell a fellow monk that you're struggling with a temptation, or that you're feeling lonely, or that you're having a bad day. You have to endure it all in silence. A kind of psychological imprisonment where your thoughts and feelings are your only company. A less known detail is that the monks were often so isolated that they would develop a kind of aphasia, a loss of the ability to speak. A chilling testament to the profound psychological toll of a life of silence. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Was the monastic solitude a form of spiritual discipline? Or was it a form of psychological torture? Historians still debate whether the silence was a genuine attempt to create a spiritual life, where a monk's mind was completely focused on God, or if it was a way to break a person's will and to make them completely subservient to the monastic rule. The truth is likely a mix of both. The solitude was a powerful spiritual tool, a way to strip a person of their worldly attachments and to bring them closer to God. But it was also a powerful tool of control, a way to create a community that was completely isolated from the outside world and from each other. It created a life that was so lonely that all you could think about was the sound of a human voice, a life that was a kind of quiet. Spiritual torture. The horrors of this solitude were not limited to a lack of conversation. The monks were also expected to live a life of quiet contemplation, and their minds were often filled with what they called acedia, a kind of spiritual sloth or boredom that was seen as a grave sin. Acedia was a state of profound restlessness, a deep sense of despair and a longing for the world outside the monastery walls. A monk suffering from acedia might be plagued by thoughts of his old life, by temptations, and by a profound sense of hopelessness. He would have to fight this battle in his mind, alone, with no one to turn to for help. It was a kind of spiritual sickness, a mental health struggle that was seen not as a problem to be solved, but as a spiritual test to be endured. A less known detail is that the Desert Fathers, the early monks who lived in complete solitude, believed that acedia was a demon that attacked them in the middle of the day. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the monastery, with its lack of emotional support and its relentless spiritual demands, was a place where a person's mental health could completely unravel. The serene image of a monk in quiet contemplation is shattered when you imagine him plagued by the profound loneliness of acedia, his mind a war zone of despair and temptation. It's a terrifying and deeply unsettling thought that a life of quiet devotion was also a life of immense and constant psychological suffering. The stillness of your room is a peaceful respite, a world away from the profound loneliness and mental health struggles of a medieval monk. We've seen how their minds were a battlefield of acedia and temptation. Now, let's talk about a more external and often forgotten part of that life, the unexpected political and economic pressures that constantly threatened a monastery's existence. This isn't a story about a spiritual retreat. It's a story about a political and economic institution that was constantly under threat from greedy nobles, feuding kings, and the ever-present threat of a bad harvest. This is a foundational historical fact. The life of a monk was not just a life of spiritual devotion, it was a life lived under a constant, and often terrifying, external pressure. Imagine you're the abbot of a wealthy monastery in the 14th century. Your monastery owns vast tracts of land, and you have a large community of monks, a library full of priceless manuscripts, and a reputation for spiritual piety. You are not just a spiritual leader, you are a lord, a landholder, and a powerful political figure in your own right. But this power comes with a price. Your wealth makes you a target. You are constantly under threat from greedy nobles who want to seize your land, from feuding kings who want your support in their wars, and from a local population that is often resentful of your wealth and your power. A less-known detail is that the abbots of some of the most powerful monasteries were often more powerful than the local lords, and they had to be skilled politicians and diplomats to survive. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Was the wealth of the monasteries a source of spiritual corruption? Or was it a necessary evil for their survival? Historians still debate whether the monastic vow of poverty was a genuine attempt to create a spiritual life, or if it was a convenient way for the abbot to maintain absolute control over the monks. While the institution itself amassed immense wealth, the truth is likely a mix of both. The monasteries were a powerful economic force. They were the bankers, the landlords, and the centers of learning. Their wealth was a source of immense power, but it was also a source of immense danger. The abbot had to be a shrewd businessman, a ruthless politician, and a spiritual leader all at once. It was a role that was often in direct conflict with the spiritual vows of the monastery. The horrifying truth is that the monasteries were often caught in the middle of larger political conflicts. A feuding king might decide that he needs the monastery's land to fund a war, or a greedy noble might decide that he needs the monastery's wealth to pay off a debt. The monks, with their vows of non-violence, had no way to defend themselves. They were often at the mercy of powerful men, and their lives and their community were constantly in danger. A less-known detail is that during the English Reformation, King Henry VIII, in a single, brutal act, dissolved all the monasteries in England, seizing their land and their wealth, and forever changing the course of English history. The monks were cast out into the world, their lives, and their community. Destroyed in a single, politically motivated act, the final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the life of a monk was not just a life of spiritual devotion, it was a life lived under a constant, and often terrifying, external pressure. The serene image of a monk in quiet contemplation is shattered when you imagine him with a heavy sword in his hand, defending his monastery from a band of marauding nobles. It's a terrifying and deeply unsettling thought that a life of quiet devotion was also a life of immense and constant political and economic danger. The stillness of your room is a peaceful respite, a world away from the political and economic pressures that threatened the monastery. We've seen how a monk's life was not just spiritual, but also deeply entangled with the messy, dangerous world outside his walls. Now, let's talk about a more intellectual and often forgotten part of that life, the monastic library. This isn't a story about a quiet room with old books. It's a story about a world of dangerous knowledge, a life of immense intellectual labor, and the surprising threats that came with a life dedicated to reading and writing. This is a foundational historical fact. The monastery, for all its spiritual piety, was also a powerful intellectual institution, and the monks were the guardians of our written history. Imagine you're a monk in the scriptorium of a large monastery in the 12th century. The scriptorium is not a cozy, well-lit room. It's a freezing, poorly lit room with a series of long wooden tables and a few simple chairs. You are a scribe, and your job is to spend your entire day, from sunrise to sunset, copying manuscripts by hand. You have a quill, a pot of ink, and a single book in front of you. The work is painstaking, and your hands are cramped. Your back is aching, and your eyes are burning from the poor light. A less-known detail is that the work was so difficult and so time-consuming that it could take months, or even years. To copy a single book, the book you're copying is not just a book, it's a priceless piece of history, and it is a powerful reminder of your spiritual duty to preserve it. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Was the monastic library a tool of intellectual preservation, or was it a tool of intellectual control? Historians still debate whether the monasteries were genuinely trying to preserve all knowledge, or if they were selectively choosing which text to copy and which to ignore. The truth is likely a mix of both. The monasteries were the only place where books were being copied and preserved. And they were, in that sense, a powerful force for intellectual preservation. But they were also a powerful force for intellectual control. The monks were often only allowed to read and copy texts that were deemed spiritually appropriate. A book on philosophy or science that challenged the authority of the church might be suppressed, or even destroyed. The library, for all its beauty and its intellectual power, was also a kind of intellectual prison. The horrifying truth is that the work of a scribe was not just physically demanding, it was also mentally challenging and often dangerous. The ink was often made with a variety of toxic ingredients, such as lead and other heavy metals. And the scribe, with his constant exposure to these poisons, would often suffer from a variety of health problems, including lead poisoning and neurological damage. A less-known detail is that the monks who worked in the scriptorium were often suffering from a form of spiritual acedia, a kind of profound restlessness and despair that was born from the monotonous and isolating nature of their work. They were surrounded by books, but they were isolated from the world, and from each other, their minds, with their constant focus on a single task, were a kind of spiritual and mental prison. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the monastic library, with all its books and all its knowledge, was often a source of immense danger. The monks were the guardians of our written history, but they were also the guardians of a dangerous and often suppressed knowledge. The library was a place of immense power, but it was also a place of immense temptation. A monk who read a forbidden book, a book on science or philosophy that challenged the authority of the church, might be excommunicated or punished. The library was not just a place of quiet contemplation, it was a place of intellectual and spiritual danger. The quiet of your room is a peaceful sanctuary, a world away from the dusty scriptorium and its intellectual pressures. We've explored the life of a medieval monk, from his profound vows to his back-breaking labor, his constant hunger, and his quiet suffering. Now, for our final chapter. Let's bring it all together. We'll connect the strange, brutal past of monastic life to our modern world, examining how the brutal realities of their existence laid the foundation for so much of what we take for granted today. This is a crucial final point, the monks, for all their hardships, were not just spiritual ascetics, They were the quiet, unsung heroes who built our world. Think back to the brutal monastic schedule, that relentless cycle of prayer and labor. This wasn't just a spiritual discipline, it was a powerful engine of production. The monks, with their organized and disciplined labor, were the farmers, the builders, the brewers, and the scholars of their time. They were the ones who preserved our written history in their scriptoria, painstakingly copying manuscripts that would have otherwise been lost to time. The knowledge you have today, the books you read, the very history we've been exploring tonight, it was all, in a very real sense, preserved by a monk with a burning candle and a cramped hand, working in a cold, lonely room. This is a foundational historical fact, the monasteries, for all their flaws, were the intellectual and economic powerhouses of the Middle Ages, but the legacy of monastic life is not just in books and buildings. It's also in our culture, in our language, and in our daily lives. The monks, with their strict, disciplined way of life, created a culture of routine, of order, and of quiet. Focused work. The very concept of a schedule, of dividing the day into set hours for work and rest, is a concept that was perfected by the monks. The idea of a quiet, reflective space, a place for contemplation and thought, is a concept that was born in the monastery. A less-known detail is that the monks, with their vow of a silence, developed a complex sign language, a kind of communication that was born out of a profound need for quiet, and a need to communicate without speaking. This act of quiet, focused communication is a testament to the creativity and the resilience of the human spirit. This brings us to a specific academic debate where the monks, the spiritual guardians of our civilization, or were they a kind of social and intellectual prison? Historians still debate whether the monastic life, with its relentless discipline and its profound isolation, was a genuine path to spiritual enlightenment, or if it was a brutal and dehumanizing form of control. The truth is, it was likely a mix of both. The monasteries were a powerful force for good, preserving knowledge, caring for the sick, and building a world that was more stable and more ordered. But they were also a place of immense suffering, a place where a person's free will, their personal desires, and their individuality were all sacrificed in the name of a greater good. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the life of a monk, with all its horrors, was a life of profound purpose. They were not just a collection of lonely, suffering men. They were a community, a living, breathing testament to the power of a shared belief. They built our world, they preserved our history, and they created a culture of quiet, focused work that is still with us today. The next time you sit in a quiet room, reading a book or working on a project, think about the monk in his cold scriptorium. His hard work, his quiet suffering, and his profound devotion are all a part of the world you live in today. It's time to dim the lights, to let the images of the monk in his cold dormitory, his hand cramping from the hard labor, and his mind fighting the demons of acedia, fade into the background. The past is a quiet place now, a story told in the darkness, but its lessons are still with us. A gentle reminder that the world we live in today was built on a foundation of quiet, and often brutal, suffering. The quiet of your room feels safe and secure, a place of peace in a world that, for most of human history, was anything but let the hum of the fan and the darkness wash over you, and let the stories of the past settle into a soft, distant memory. There's no need for hard labor or a relentless schedule tonight. Just the gentle quiet and a well-earned rest. You're safe now. Good night.